Hello,
this
Leila.
morning. It's good to see
I'm
you.
well.
I'm here today with David Gordon-Duke, who is a Vancouverite, born and bred. I think he even lived in Vancouver before he was born. He knows the city inside out. He's a composer, educator, writer, and he studied at UBC and then went on to do a master's at Duke University, right?
North Carolina.
North
Duke was
Carolina.
where we
Okay.
went. Yeah.
Duke was where you went, what?
That was where we escaped from the North Carolinians to go and have bagels. It was about 10 miles down the road.
Okay. And you played the violin for quite a long time, and you studied composition with Jean Coulthard, amongst others. And Jean Coulthard, who probably many people know, is a revered Canadian composer. And currently, you lecture at VCC and you write on musical matters, and you also do reviews and whatever you call them for the Vancouver Sun, previews, right?
That's right.
So here's a question for you to start. Do you prefer to write reviews or previews? And do you think the purpose of both are each one is quite different?
The business of writing review is one thing, which relies on speed and description. And I could tell you about some of the interesting aspects we've had about all of that, because I think the most excruciating experience I've ever had as a critic was having to phone in my copy while Renee Fleming was still singing at the Orpheum one night because of deadlines. Previews, you have a lot of time, but you also have to realize that while you're there to make the public want to go to an event, there is a fine line between that. Well, maybe it's not so fine a line, but there's a line between that and being a publicist. And I used to like reviews more than previews, to be frank about it, because you go to the concert, you do your thing, and it's over. Previews used to take me more time to figure out what was the thing to do. But at the Sun, we had a policy early on that previews needed to have some aspect of an interview in. And that was the really exciting thing, to get to talk to people who I'd never be able to call up and say, "This is David Gordon-Duke from the Vancouver Sun. Would you like to talk to me, Renee Fleming?" And so it was a lovely experience. It has been a lovely experience to be able to ask questions to the great and the good of the world of music.
So, in terms of, let's just go to writing reviews for now. Of course, with the development and use of the internet, I guess everybody thinks they're a reviewer. And to what extent would you feel that, say, a review in the Vancouver Sun could be prestigious or more relevant? Does it have the same meaning as it would have had before everybody and his dog could write a review?
Well, I love that everybody now can write a review, because the idea of any 2 or 3 critics in the world being able to make or break a career is not something I would want to be part of. I often ask myself, all right, who am I writing for? Well, I'm writing for people who weren't at the event and want to still stay current. And that way I can usually say, you should have been there. Sometimes it's, oh my, you should have been there.
Yes.
And then I'm writing for people who were there at the same time to say, well, your opinion is, of course, what counts. If you loved it, you loved it. I see it as, about the biggest classroom I've ever had. I hope my reviews don't become too didactic, but nonetheless, I want to be able to say, well, you didn't particularly like that, but I was over the moon with Lang Lang playing Albaneth, for instance. And that gives me then, I think, an opportunity to do, this sounds so lame, but nonetheless, a bit of good in terms of promoting and increasing our, our awareness of quality and our, I hope to be able to encourage people to explore some repertoire they might not otherwise have considered. So the idea of just, oh, that was no good. I think I've written about 2 reviews in getting on to 15 years of that type of thing, because that doesn't happen very often. I just think the whole thing is how lucky I am to be able to go to these sorts of things and then have a chance to say, well, here's what I thought. What did you? And the implicit end of every review is, so what did you think?
I remember in probably it was the second year of the VRS, 1981. And there was a not very wonderful review of a pianist who played the night before. And of course, the reviews came out the next day in those good old days. And at that time, I was the only person who actually worked in what was considered the VRS office, which actually was my husband's study. And the phone rang. And it was a woman who said, "Mrs. Getz, I have a question for you." And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I was at the concert last night and I really enjoyed it. And then I saw the review in this morning's paper. Was I wrong to enjoy it?" What do you say to someone like that?
Like and review are 2 different things. What I like as an individual music goer is what I like. And that's all well and good. As a
Yes.
reviewer, I have to try and put that, or at least I do try and put that aside, and not just say, well, gee, I like that music and I like that performer. I have to try and say why I liked it. I've got to say that that over the almost 40 years, I've had a sort of a connection with the Vancouver Recital Society. It has been the education of education to hear and now to review programs of people who are able to put together the most astonishing musical ideas. Every program is a lecture in a funny sort of way. It's it's an artist saying, "I want you to hear these pieces, and I want you to hear what I'm going to do with these pieces." And so, the idea of program building, the idea of then threading together a program, so it's not just, well, one from column A and one from column B. This one learns by going to concerts.
So actually, you raise a point now, which I never even had thought about coming into these discussions, but I think is quite relevant to what you just said. And that is the art of programming. To what extent do you think that should be addressed when students are at college and hoping to embark upon careers? And is programming an art or a science?
Yes, I do really think that that we should spend more time with our college students and university students and the graduate students talking about the art, and I think it is an art rather than a science of programming. If it was a science, you'd be able to say, well, we plug in the following variables and we get then the result. The art of programming, as done by a master, I'm thinking Thomas Adish, I'm thinking of Murray Pariah, I'm thinking of any number of people who understand that the 2 hours we spend in the concert hall is a short time, but it's a long journey, and it starts when the performer comes out on stage and their opening piece, and ends with hopefully an encore, or maybe not if it's a piece that just can't be followed with anything. We are being taken into the performer's musical soul in how they choose to put things through. Now, I think very young performers or very inexperienced performers often get, let's call it scientific advice. Well, start with this because that's a good warm-up piece, and then let's get your Rachmaninoff out of the way because that you need to recover after that, and so on and so forth, and that produces a certain a sameness that we see sometimes. We don't see it as much as we used to in graduating recitals and first or couple of years of performing, where you feel obliged to show everything that you can possibly do.
Talking about programming and what students learn or don't learn while they're studying music. So let's just jump for a second to competitions. Let's talk about the piano competition. Let's talk about the Montreal competition, the Leeds, although Leeds changed last year, the Clyburn. When young people apply to enter the competition, they are required to offer Bach or, a classical sonata of Haydn and Mozart or Beethoven. They have a piece that's a free choice and a big romantic work. So to what extent is it reasonable to ask a performer to be able to play everything? And what is wrong with being a specialist performer?
Oh, don't get me started. But then I don't really have a right to an opinion in a professional way about this because I do not prepare young artists for performance. And the great teachers who do have far more wisdom on this subject than, a critic for the Vancouver Sun. I don't think, however, there is anything wrong with playing a little bit of everything as long as you realize that at a certain point in your life, you're going to probably move into some specialties. Let's talk of two specific recent sort of concerts, or certainly people that are deeply associated with the VRS, Leifo Viansness and Yuja Wan. Now, Leifo Viansness is a remarkable pianist, and at one point, and I think it still holds, he always would put a piece that he had just learned or that was new on a program because he was committed to the idea of, well, you really need to hear some of Nielsen's piano music, or you really need to hear, or whatever. And so you could make the argument that that type of diversity works against somebody who plays Schubert so explicitly. Wouldn't it be better? Well, he obviously thinks not. And so I'm prepared to learn from his idea that this is what I do. And you should appreciate that I've tucked some pieces by Frank Martin into my program. Yuja Wang, in that very controversial recital just before the shutdown, was embarking on a type of programming which she certainly doesn't need to do. She's a young woman who could play anything she wanted and people would be ecstatic. But she embarked on the idea of the Journey program with all sorts of pieces, even going so far as to not want the audience to have a list of, so here we are, we're in this particular piece. She was trying to show that she was a generalist in a new sort of way, rather than what you were talking about for the competitions of here's your Bach, here's your classical sonata, here's your big romantic work, and I guess you better play something modern. One thing that I find really interesting about competitions, which again, I don't really have much right to talk about, but when there's an imposed piece, boy, is that ever a good way of finding out what the actual musical imagination of the individual is, because they have to deal with that themselves.
Yes, exactly.
And if I can just go slightly off track here, I was once commissioned by a music teachers group to write horrible pieces for an advanced competition, sort of grades 9, 10, and AR level. And I put in all sorts of things that I think are important that could go wrong, and phrasing tricks and things. It was fascinating how the difference between students who thought, well, I hate this, I just will do what I have to, so I'll get the rhythms and the pitch is correct, and the people who said, oh, wait a second, that was a subito pianissimo, and so on and so forth.
What I do want to fit in now that we're talking about composers and compositions is that you and I actually met in 1982 at the Arts Club on Granville Island when Jackie Parker, John Kimura Parker, played a recital for us and included in that program one of your pieces. Do you remember what piece it was?
Well, I do, because it's my piano sonatina, which I had written 5 or 6 years earlier. And the way Jackie, who he was to me in those days, got to know the piece was I was up at the Banff Center of Happy Memory, since it seems to be in terrible straits as we chat this morning. I was doing a composer's workshop, and part of it was that the young performers floating around were strong-armed into playing some of the pieces. So Jackie actually gave the official premiere of my little sonatina. Little in that it's short, it's technically fairly demanding, and it got rather good responses from the Banff performance. And then a few years later, John Kimura Parker won the Eckhart Grammaté competition, and the deal is that you get a national tour and you are asked to play some Canadian repertoire. Well, yes, of course. And so he then got to work and really got my little piano sonatina into top form, and that was quite edifying.
I must have liked the piece. Otherwise, we wouldn't be still be friends today, would we?
I suppose. Although one never knows. And of course, having now been connected with the VRS, that then becomes complicated as a composer. You can't sort of be connected to an organization and keep hawking your own music. That doesn't work. So actually, as it's happened, I was thinking about this, 2.7 performances of my works, because there was the commission for Stephen Isserlis, which is another story. And then,
well, I don't know whether tell that.
Yeah, well, we will. But then there's the 0.7, which was in a tiny little miniature of mine, got tucked in on a program of Rena Sharon and Scott St. John.
Right.
And the story that I like about that one is that I had started just reviewing for the Sun. And I had to call up my editor and said, oh, Michael Scott, I think Rena's going to tuck in this little piece of mine, and I suppose I can't review the concert. And Michael said, well, what would you say about it? And I said, well, probably that Rena played beautifully, but really it was a trifle by a provincial wannabe Brahms. So why bother? And he said, okay, you can go ahead. As it happened, the review didn't happen, but there was never a particular issue about my objectivity after that. But to go back to Stephen Isserlis, I mean, the opportunity to write for Stephen Isserlis, period, exclamation mark, was wonderful. The piece, which is called "Though Now We Sleep," improvisations on Kwakiutl songs, came about because you were presenting Stephen in the amazing space at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC with the greatest of great First Nations poles. And I had just finished about a decade of working with the ethnomusicologist Ida Halpern and transcribing mainly and analyzing some of her immensely valuable collection of music from First Nations peoples. And it seemed she had died. It seemed like the thing to do to try and write a piece for at least purportedly solo cello based on fragments from this music that I had become familiar with. I'll tell you the story because the issue was, and it's a hot button issue now, which is the idea of cultural appropriation.
Yes.
And it's more significant now, and of course, it's a serious issue, and one needs to think about it. Ida Halpern, who was a music critic and as well as an ethnomusicologist and one of the great characters in the Vancouver music scene, it was her almost fondest wish that Canadian composers would learn how First Nations music, particularly from West Coast, operated and try and make use of it in respectful and appropriate ways. So knowing that and knowing that much of the construction of Kwakiutl music is relating to cells and motives. It's not like here's a big tune. It's patterns and intervals and rhythms. I felt that having transcribed these pieces, I could, with some degree of honesty, use them as a springboard for my own musical ideas. And then, as the piece developed, and I got through the 4 improvisations based on four songs, I decided for a finale I needed a coda. And that's when the piece really gelled. And at that point in the piece, Stephen has played so magnificently that we actually hear the songs that Halpern recorded coming from behind the totem poles, swirling around the audience. And with Stephen's work done, and this became almost too much for me, I wrote Dr. Halpern into the piece because when I was clearing out her music, I found some arrangements of synagogue chant from her days in 1930s, 1920s Vienna, and I moved Stephen to that, while in counterpoint with the First Nations music that's been brought back, and the piece ends.
So, I mean, the other thing that we should enlighten people who are listening to this chat we're having is the really strong connection you've had to the VRS since 1982. You have been a board member. You have been my principal coach, advisor, sympathizer, doctor, psychiatrist. In the years when I programmed the Vancouver Chamber Music Festival. And, you know, if ever I have a musicological question or if I'm offered a program that looks slightly outrageous, I would always go to you and say, hey, can I get away with doing this? So you are very much an integral part of the journey of the VRS. I hope that the VRS will survive these challenging times that everybody is going through. And when we come out the other end, that you will still be around aiding
and abetting
this old lady.
The thing is that you know, what did people tell you back in the early 80s about starting a recital society?
Oh, they said it was ridiculous. And I still wanted to present young up-and-coming artists that nobody'd heard of. What you want is someone who's committed to what they're sharing with an audience and delighting in what they're doing. And that's what makes all the difference. That's the essence of it. I mean, every time I hear Murray Pariah play, I think, you know, he's eaten the score, he's devoured it. It's just inside him. And as he's playing, that's what the composer wanted.
I think bringing up Pariah is very, very interesting because I treat every Marie Pariah recital as a graduate seminar. I go there not to listen to him, but to learn. But I do remember, and this is some time ago, a little lunch that you had, and you invited me along. And Mr. Pariah is a wonderful man, but he's not loquacious in a conventional sense like you or I. And you mentioned that I had been studying as part of my graduate work at UVic, Schenkerian analysis, and you mentioned this at the luncheon, and he explained how his process is correct for this discussion of how he would think and analyze works for years before thinking he could program them and work on the overall shape and dimension of his program. It wasn't just, oh, let's have some Chopin and let's have some Bach. It's no, there's got to be a connection, and in the most intellectually rich way.
Maybe we should close this off with another funny Marie Pariah story. And you said lunch reminded you. So on one of his visits here, which may have been the second one before the last one, he wasn't feeling great and he had some stomach problems. He was playing the concert at the Orpheum, and Dunn's had opened down the street, and it was kind of a sort of a Jewish delicatessen. So I said, I had this brainwave, and I said, oh, Murray, I know what you can have for lunch. I've got the perfect answer. Hang on a second. I'm just going to run down the street and see if it's available. So I charged, from the stage door of the Orpheum into Dunn's, and the receptionist was there waiting to greet me. And I said, do you have chicken and matzo ball soup? And she looked at me like I came out of the sky. And she said, what? I said, do you have chicken and matzo ball soup? She said, we have chicken soup. And I said, oh, but this is a Jewish delicatessen. Why don't you have matzo balls? She said, what are those? I said, well, those are the round things that go in the chicken. She said, oh, yes, you mean the dumplings. So I ran back and I got Murray, and he had his chicken and matzo ball soup for lunch, and he played an incredible concert.
Now, this is a very instructive thing that you have just said, and you won't say this, so I'm going to say it, and you can respond or blush or whatever. There are, I believe, not that many presenters, impresarios, society artistic directors who worry about artists getting the proper nourishment before a concert. And I think that's part of the, it's a huge part of the VRS success story. It's that people come to Vancouver. They may not necessarily have known about Vancouver. They may not have met you, but by the time they've played their concert and had breakfast the next day, about 107% of them want to come back, because so many of the best and the brightest make their Canadian and, in many instances, North American debuts here. Guess who gets quoted in people's press releases because they've been reviewed in Vancouver.
Exactly.
And so I have found it slightly shocking that people will quote the Vancouver Sun's reviewer found, as opposed to the New York Times had this to say. So something special is happening, and it's impossible to figure out exactly the formula. It's an art, right? Not a science. So the formula can't be written in stone. But as long may it last.
Yes, absolutely, David. And
thanks for chatting.
Thank you so much. Take care. Look after yourself.
Bye-bye.
Bye.